Hi guys, welcome back to the Endurance Podcast. How you doing, Tim? Had a good week?
Hi Tom, I'm doing great, thanks. It's sunny outside, I'm indoors, but I'm pretty happy to sit indoors because I'm pretty tired from the week full of cycling.
That's nice to make the most of the cycling because your study's starting now, isn't it? So you're going to be quite busy going forward.
Yeah, we are doing heat acclimations now because the winter started.
Perfect timing. How's the study going?
Okay. We are just starting, so recruiting participants and hoping that they will survive the biopsies.
Lovely. So today we're going to talk a little bit about recovery. Obviously, we're going to focus a bit more on the nutrition side of things. But I think it's important to think about recovery as a key part of your training plan, really, and making sure that you've got an good overall training plan, well balanced with days off where you need it, and also thinking about getting enough rest, getting enough sleep. Especially, you might think it's something that pros have to think about more, doing so much more volume than your average amateur rider or your amateur athlete. It's probably more like the other way around. Pros have all day to recover, take a nap, eat good meals, whereas people who are training around work, they're often rushing around, maybe not got their sort of training late at night, so they're running into their sleep time and can find it a little bit harder to recover in that sense. You got any insight in how the pro guys manage their days to recover well from their hard training sessions?
Like personally, I would actually say that the recovery is even harder for those people that are like working full time and caring for kids than it is for professionals, because professionals basically they come home and they don't have much on that day anyway, so they can like rest, sit down, play video games, and eat and just think about the next training sessions. Whereas like normal people need to like go to work and simply don't have the time to like prepare food, don't have the time to even think about food like every few hours, or they have to like do some more physical work, like do something like walk around. And I find it like mentally much more difficult to recover, even physically, when I'm like working in the labs, standing, walking around the school. And those days are really hard. And I usually don't recover as well as on days when they're more quiet. But obviously, I think that the most important pillar of recovery is basically rest, do nothing. And then obviously the next one is nutrition. And perhaps they come hand in hand with each other. And like, honestly, professionals probably are not doing anything they're not doing anything special in terms of recovery. It's all about like getting the basics right. And I think this is pretty simple stuff, to be honest.
Yeah, so I guess from a nutrition point of view, and you as a nutritionist, I know you're advising the guys on their eating throughout the day, but especially during and after the training sessions. For me, I think fueling well during the session is the first step to recovery, because if you're fueling well in the session, you're following Tim's advice and getting in enough carbohydrates over the course of that session. You're not finishing completely depleted and on your knees. I mean, you might still do that, but then you've got quite a big training load from having done that. But fueling well during the session is really the starting point for me.
Yeah, I think like it's actually an interesting thing is that like absorption doesn't happen like immediately. Like you have a gel, I don't know, 20 minutes before the end of the session. So these carbohydrates will probably not be like completely absorbed by the time you finish a session. So they will actually start being absorbed, or will be absorbed when you finish your session. So the carbohydrates will be kind of immediately available for the recovery. And I think this is kind of super important, because you get the carbohydrates straight in and you start replenishing carbohydrate stores or glycogen stores. And then that really helps. So it's both like you don't go too deep, like in terms of like too low in energy levels, because we know, for instance, that being low on glycogen means higher rates of protein degradation, which is basically breaking down muscle for energy. And we don't want that. So I think it's like kind of, multiple benefits of having like carbohydrates around, especially towards the end of the training session. And sometimes like overfeeding toward the end of the training session can be even good in terms of like training the gut. So having carbohydrates towards the end of the session is always really important from all aspects. So this is a really good starting point.
Yeah, you mentioned muscle damage and kind of preventing too much muscle damage. Also, you're going to be having to maintain your immune system, aren't you? You know, not going completely deep and depleting your glycogen stores. You're not going to have hammered your immune system so much that you're more likely to be able to keep training, not get ill, which I think is the key point, really, isn't it? You know, a lot of the benefits of training, you know, the key is consistency and not being ill, not being injured. So those little day-to-day things to improve your recovery from each training session means you're going to get a better stimulus overall, and you're going to improve more from your training plan.
Yeah, and I probably should mention here like a big misconception that some people say, well, we add protein during exercise, like actually reduce the breakdown of muscle, but it's actually the carbohydrates that are reducing the breakdown. So protein needs to be especially ingested after exercise. And during exercise, I would probably only recommend protein when you're doing some like a glycogen depleted training sessions, when it is actually the aim to kind of do the training sessions with low carbohydrate availability. And this is kind of a tool in the toolbox of the coach and the athlete that's might be used sometimes, but you have to be really careful about it. And first and foremost, it's about carbohydrates, getting them high and getting them in sufficient quantities. And only then we start talking about protein. And I think the protein actually, when it starts to be important, is probably like immediately and after the training sessions. That's when you get the protein synthesis rates up, and you want like the material for this to actually happen. So the building blocks, so amino acids, and this is basically protein that you ingest after exercise.
So I've seen, in the TV coverage of races when most teams really finish a race, but especially with Boy, I've noticed the riders there have packet of Haribo and like a juice drink straight away afterwards, then doing the interviews given by the soigneur. So you're then just starting the carbohydrate feeding straight away. It doesn't look particularly like a protein shake they're having afterwards. Is that something that comes later on the bus, or I can't really tell what's in the drink. It looks like a bright kind of juice syrupy kind of drink to me. But
yes, so I think like different teams have different strategies. My opinion is that the first and the most important part of the recovery is carbohydrates, because if you actually want to kind of replenish glycogen stores for the next day, the timing of getting the carbohydrates as quickly as possible is crucial. Because if you think about it, if they finish a stage by like 4 or 5 p.m., they only have like 4 or 5 hours of time before they go to bed. And this is kind of the timing is limited for actually being able to get the carbohydrates into the body. Because it would be much easier if the races started very early in the morning. Then you would have like loads of time in the afternoon. But this is not really the case. So you have to kind of be as quick as possible with carbohydrates. And yeah, like one of the things that you probably see with the Tadej Pogacar and probably some other riders as well is they get Fanta, or they get some simple carbohydrates as soon as possible. And in our case, I don't want to say like be too specific in terms of what we do, but based on like the evidence, it's a combination of carbohydrates coming from fructose and glucose, which we know speeds up the recovery of both carbohydrate stores, so liver and muscle. Protein is then probably ingested like either immediately after the exercise or then later on the bus when we like take out the protein and add some more carbohydrates. It's probably very similar in all the cycling teams. But yeah, the carbohydrates are the first source of energy, and protein probably plus minus 15 minutes later.
Yeah. And I guess there's a bit of a misconception that you need lots of protein to recover, whereas in reality, I think probably the key is small amounts regularly throughout the day, and especially in that post-exercise periods, or something like a recovery shake is ideal when you're getting that sort of 20-30 grams of protein in there alongside your carbohydrates.
I think like this misconception started when people started to look at the diet of elite athletes, and because elite athletes tend to use normal food, so I don't know, pasta, veggies, like meat or whatever. And if you like take a look at the composition or even pasta, you will see protein in there. And because the quantities are so high, the total protein intake per day could actually get to like 3 grams per kilogram of body mass. So people started thinking, well, I also need these 3 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body mass. But this is not actually the case. Protein, yeah. But that's not actually the case, because this protein is probably like pretty low quality, and you probably only need like 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram of body mass of high quality protein. And this is pretty easy to like achieve, like morning, 20 to 30 grams, immediately post exercise, usually like 30 grams, and then another meal perhaps, and then the dinner. And then you can easily like get to sufficient amounts. And I think, in my personal opinion, is that because carbohydrates are the energy, so it's the energy that is the most important part of the recovery, because without energy, you can't perform, even like with completely fresh muscles in terms of like no damage or whatsoever. So if you want to kind of speed up the recovery of glycogen stores, then we need certain amount of carbohydrates, and that's the most important. And then we start thinking about the protein. But distribution of protein is important, like getting a few meals, like the protein intake to be distributed throughout the day. So like morning, immediately post exercise, perhaps something in between the dinner and the end of the stage, because like some transfers can be really long. But sometimes the dinner is pretty early, like, 7 o'clock, 7, 8. And then before bed, they have some more protein, like skyr or quark. It's also down to personal preferences, I guess. But we just don't like do massively on, or nobody does massively on like protein powders or protein bars. That's just not a thing. It's probably a thing of amateurs, and probably a thing of like industry pushing to kind of sell those products. It's more about like getting the energy in the carbohydrates, and varied diet. And we actually rarely use any like special products just for recovery.
Yeah. So if you're eating enough in terms of total energy, total calories, and you're getting quite a varied diet, and you're including different forms of protein in that, in terms of sort of high quality protein, often is more animal forms of protein, but obviously there's vegetarian, vegan alternatives as well. It's maybe a little bit more difficult to achieve that amino acid profile, but it's kind of possible. But as a side effect really of having a big energy intake throughout the day, people are generally getting enough protein in their diet as it is.
Yeah, exactly. So it's pretty kind of easy to get the protein in sufficient quantities, as long as you basically make sure that you eat real food, and that you kind of vary the diet. And obviously in professional cycling, all the teams have professional chefs and high quality ingredients. It might be more difficult, for instance, for like people that work every single day. For instance, if I go to get some lunch for myself when I'm working, I need to think about the protein, because in Haribos, unfortunately, there isn't much protein. So I have to get this component into my diet as well. But otherwise, I think, the most important things are definitely carbohydrates.
Please tell me you don't eat Haribo for lunch.
I do.
You've got a deserved reputation, Tim.
Sorry.
So you told me earlier the 3 R's of recovery. You described them as rehydration, replenishing, and rebuilding. Can you tell us a little bit more about those? I guess rehydration is fairly obvious, but
yeah. So basically, we need to think about 3 things, and the first one is getting the energy stores up again, and like in the first few hours after you finish the exercise, the muscle is most kind of wants to at least is in the best state to store glycogen. So the replenishment of glycogen stores will be really quick. And I think this is especially crucial if you kind of, for instance, train twice a day, or the time between 2 training sessions is limited, because we know that for complete replenishment of muscle glycogen stores, we would ideally have like 48 hours or 2 days. Whereas if we train like daily, we only have like 20 hours perhaps of recovery. And this recovery is interspersed with sleeping. So we lose another 8 hours when we can't really ingest any food. So we are really limited. And that's why we kind of need to get the carbohydrates in as quickly as possible. Especially
if, say, as an amateur, you are training after work. You've not got a huge amount of time after that before you go to bed.
So this is kind of super important. Sometimes you can actually do the training sessions with low carbohydrate availability the next day, for instance. And this is something amateur riders would probably benefit more than professionals, because the training volume is not so big. And that is why, like, for instance, that's what I do, because I rarely have breakfast before a training session in the morning, or sometimes I'm just reducing the carbohydrate intake and really focus on protein. But otherwise, I would say that the first few hours, getting the carbohydrates in makes most sense. And then in the evening or later in the day, you can adjust. Or if you're training in the evening, you have the carbohydrates straight after. But then the next day, before the training session, you adjust whether you want more or less carbohydrates. And then obviously the next thing is protein. You need to provide the body with building blocks for recovery and adaptations. So you basically probably damage some of the muscle fibers during exercise. But most importantly, you want new structures. You want new mitochondria, for instance. You want new blood vessels, capillaries, whatever. And for this, protein is required. So you want kind of maximize this process, and you need like 30 grams of protein for this. And then obviously the last thing is rehydration. So you want to replenish what you've lost in terms of fluid. And this is especially important in the summer months. So we are going into the winter now. Hydration becomes less of an important topic, but so carbohydrates and the protein are probably the most important part. Yeah.
And you mentioned kind of getting those carbohydrates and protein in early first thing, and then using the rest of the day to manage what you need in terms of the makeup of the rest of the diet. I guess that's important, especially at the pro level. People are always trying to manage their weight, quite closely. So you like finish the race, finish the training session, really hammer the carbohydrates and the proteins, then maybe look back and think, right, this is my expenditure for the day. That means I've got X, Y, Z left, and sort of plan the rest of the meals for the day around that, after you've kind of really focused on just getting the carbs and recovery in the first hours.
Yeah. So one of the things that people kind of get wrong most of the time is either fuel too little during exercise, or simply like go back, come home, and then go for a shower, clean the bike, do some stuff around the home, and like they simply delay the first feeding by an hour or an hour and a half, and they need to like prepare the food and stuff, and this is just like a lost time basically. So I really like to say to all my athletes to have carbohydrates and protein like a snack straight after they get home, so they initiate the process of recovery, and this also gives them time to then do the cleaning of the bike, to take the time to shower, and then cook a proper meal that they can have like an hour or a couple of hours later, and also like getting the easy meal, or like easy to prepare meal, easy to digest meal, means like simple carbohydrates, which can be like quickly absorbed into the body. And by doing this, you probably help with reducing the kind of the hunger that you might have when eating the proper meal, because it's always, or like one of the problems is that you basically, when you delay the feeding into like the recovery bit, you kind of end up super hungry, and then you just eat loads of food which you don't actually need, because remember, like after like each and every hard session, you might not want to eat loads of food overall, because if next day is just an easy training session and you want to lose some body mass, then perhaps you don't want to kind of replenish all the energy, but at the same time you have to kind of still be able to do the work, to think and care for the family, whatever. So if you kind of have like really a huge hunger sensations, then this might be a problem. And by eating just after a training session, you probably help reducing this problem.
Yeah, I think that goes back to one of the first things we said, really, doesn't it, about fueling the training session itself well. I know from my own experience on the days when I've been fueling the session well, like during the ride, you come back and you eat, but you don't feel the need to go completely overboard. Whereas to the other extreme, you come back, you've not ate particularly well, taken on carbs as much in the training session, you get distracted by something as soon as you come in the door, and then an hour later you think, well, I'm getting the bonk here, and then you want to just eat the whole fridge. So it's about planning what's coming up, fueling the training itself well, and then the rest of it follows quite easily from that, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I think it's kind of simple solutions work really well. And then sometimes like even think, like, for instance, if you have like a 4-hour long training session, that you kind of start to build up the carbohydrate intake, so that you start with lower amounts and then progress toward higher amounts, and this way you basically fuel well for the training session, then fuel the recovery, it's gonna work pretty well, I think. And one of the things that's also kind of helps is, for instance, endurance products are made of fructose and glucose mixture, and in terms of recovery, we've done actually a lot of work here in Birmingham, showing that this way you also speed up the recovery because fructose primarily targets liver glycogen stores, whereas glucose is really bad for helping to resynthesize liver glycogen stores after exercise. So basically, if you have just rice, for instance, after exercise, you will be replenishing muscle glycogen, but completely forgetting about the liver. And you can kind of want to have the sugars in because this way you basically fill up both stores. And if I tell you that liver glycogen stores are very likely the biggest kind of if you have low liver glycogen stores, then you will feel more hungry. It then kind of adds to the point why having a mixture of fructose and glucose-based carbohydrates is really important.
Yeah, I think most nutrition brands now are kind of on the bandwagon in terms of fructose-based drinks for during racing training. But not so much in that recovery period. I think people think carbohydrates and protein, but not necessarily the makeup of the carbs as much as during training, during racing.
I think that the recovery is really, really important because liver glycogen stores, the repletion of them can also take ages. And if you don't get the fructose in, it just takes forever. And interestingly, by adding fructose, you're not like then causing the muscle glycogen stores to not go as high or the replenishment rate to go down. So basically you get the same muscle glycogen replenishment rate, but higher liver glycogen replenishment rate. So you get more for the same amount.
So win-win.
Yeah.
Great. I think we've covered most of what we wanted to talk about today, haven't we? So we'll back to the drawing board, try and think of another topic for next time.
Yeah, right. Perhaps like just sum up everything. So get the carbohydrates as quickly as possible. They can be simple sugars. Add some protein. Then start thinking about what's coming. I really like to say like have around 1 gram per kilogram of body mass of carbohydrates, or 0.8 if you add some protein. So like 50 to 60 grams of carbohydrates, 30 grams of protein. First hour, you're like, that's the best you can have. That's like a regen. We build it based on that. And then you start thinking what's coming, what are the goals of the next training session, how are you feeling like, and then you adjust the carbohydrate intake, you adjust the protein intake, but keep in mind that protein intake, like you need to have it like every 3 to 4 hours, whereas carbohydrate intake, if you're in need of high glycogen stores the next day, you probably want to have like carbohydrates on an hourly basis, and the protein follows like when you feed every 3 to 4 hours. And the recovery starts during exercise, probably the last hour of exercise, pretty much.
Yeah. And in the planning of your training around that as well, and your nutritional intake.
Yeah. So
nice, simple take-home messages for everyone, and everyone's going to be recovering well from their training this winter.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, always feel free to drop like the comments down below, and we'll try to answer them next time around. And also, like, if you have any suggestions for the topics, feel free to write to us, and we'll make it happen.
Fantastic. Maybe it'd be good to, if people put down what's their typical recovery meal following the training session. Do you go with the regen protein shake type route, or do you go with a meal? What's the composition of it? Thanks, guys, and I'll see you next time.
Yeah, see you.